The world has spent centuries perfecting the art of glorifying the iron will, building monuments to the stoic and writing epics for the ones who do not break under the weight of the sky. We are taught from our first breath that to be strong is the ultimate virtue, the shield against the chaos of existence, and the only currency worth holding in a volatile world. Yet we are never told about the quiet rot that sets in when that shield becomes a cage. Society looks at the unyielding person and sees a finished product, a masterpiece of resilience that requires no maintenance and no mercy, completely ignoring the fact that a pillar which never leans is the first to crack when the earth finally shifts. This is the hidden deception of the modern hero's journey. We celebrate the capability to endure while staying silent about the emotional tax levied against those who refuse to scream. We have mistaken the absence of complaint for the absence of pain, and in doing so, we have turned our strongest individuals into ghosts who haunt their own lives, performing a role of invulnerability that was never meant to be lived in perpetuity. Strength is framed as a glorious power, a light that guides others through the dark, but for the one carrying the torch, it is often a blinding heat that prevents them from seeing the hands reaching out to help. We must begin by deconstructing this idol of the unbreakable spirit and realize that what we call strength is frequently just a sophisticated survival mechanism that has outgrown its purpose, leaving a person standing tall in a desert of their own making, where the only thing more absolute than their competence is the profound silence of being completely and utterly misunderstood by everyone they protect. The burden of the strong is not the weight they carry for themselves, but the invisible expectations that settle like lead upon their shoulders the moment they prove they can handle the pressure. Once you demonstrate that you can weather the storm without flinching, the world stops offering you an umbrella and instead starts asking you to hold theirs, creating a parasitic relationship where your perceived capability becomes an invitation for others to outsource their own struggles to you. This is where the psychological isolation begins to take root, as the strong person slowly realizes that their value in the eyes of society is directly proportional to their utility and their silence. People do not flock to the strong to offer comfort. They gravitate toward them to find it, turning the resilient individual into a sanctuary where everyone else can rest while the sanctuary itself has no place to lay its head. There is a haunting loneliness in being the person everyone relies on because it establishes a hierarchy that precludes true intimacy, as vulnerability is the bridge to connection, and the strong have been told that vulnerability is the one luxury they cannot afford. You become a landmark, a fixed point in the lives of others that is expected to be permanent and unchanging. But a landmark is not a person, and a fixed point cannot grow or hurt or cry out for a reprieve. The emotional cost of this expectation is a slow erosion of the self, where you begin to believe your own myth, suppressing the very human need for support because you have been conditioned to believe that needing someone is a betrayal of the identity you have worked so hard to build in the eyes of an admiring but distant public. If we look beneath the surface of the capable exterior, we find a complex architecture of emotional suppression that functions like a dam, holding back a lifetime of unvoiced exhaustion. For the person identified by their strength, every moment of internal struggle is viewed as a systemic failure rather than a natural human process, leading to a state of constant self-surveillance where they must police their own emotions to ensure the mask of competence never slips. This is not power. It is a high-stakes performance of isolation disguised as independence, a way of moving through the world where you are always present for others, but never truly seen by them. The psychological pressure of maintaining this facade creates a profound rift between the public persona of the leader and the private reality of the human being who is drowning in the middle of a calm sea. We talk about strength as if it is a choice made in the light, but for many, it is a fortress built in the dark to survive a world that did not have room for their fragility. The tragedy of the strong is that they are often the most sensitive souls who simply learned how to armor themselves better than the rest. Yet that armor is heavy and it lacks any joints for an embrace. They move through life with a crushing awareness that if they were to falter, the entire ecosystem of people depending on them would collapse. And so they continue to march forward, fueled by a sense of duty that has long since replaced their sense of joy. It is a silent contract signed in blood, where they agree to be the foundation of everyone else's happiness in exchange for the right to be respected, but never truly known or held in the way a tired child is held. The realization that strength can be a prison usually comes in the quiet hours when the utility of the day has faded and the strong person is left alone with the echoes of their own endurance. In these moments, the philosophical weight of their solitude becomes undeniable, revealing that the very traits which allowed them to succeed have also served to insulate them from the warmth of genuine community. People admire the strong from a distance, much like one admires a mountain, forgetting that the peak of a mountain is a cold and desolate place where nothing can grow and the air is too thin for most to breathe. This is the ultimate irony of being the anchor. While you hold the ship steady during the gale, you are also the one submerged in the depths, separated by fathoms of water from the life happening on the deck above. The stronger you become, the more you are expected to be self-sufficient, until the people around you stop checking in altogether, assuming that you are always fine because you have mastered the art of looking fine. This absence of inquiry is a subtle form of abandonment, a collective agreement that the strong do not need care, which further reinforces the individual's internal narrative that they must handle everything in total solitude. They begin to view their own needs as inconveniences or signs of weakness, further withdrawing into the sanctuary of their own competence until the walls are so thick that no one could get through even if they tried. It is a slow-motion separation from the fabric of human interdependency, a tragic evolution where the person who is most capable of helping everyone else becomes the one person whom no one knows how to help, leaving them stranded on an island of their own excellence. We must finally confront the uncomfortable truth that being the strongest person in the room is often a symptom of a profound failure of the collective to provide safety for the individual. If you have always had to be strong, it usually means you were never allowed to be safe, and the isolation you feel today is the lingering shadow of a past where you were your only protector. This chapter is the first step in unmasking the lie that strength is its own reward. It is a call to recognize that true power is not the ability to stand alone, but the courage to stop pretending that you don't need anyone else. As we move forward, we will peel back the layers of this silent burden, exploring how the invisible expectations of society have shaped your loneliness, and how the very things people praise you for are the things that keep you awake at night. This is not a celebration of the lone wolf, but a post-mortem of the cage that the wolf built for itself out of necessity and pride. We are entering the territory of the unspoken, where the armor comes off and the skin beneath is revealed to be just as tender as anyone else's, perhaps even more so because it has been covered for so long. Strength is not what you think it is. It is not the iron in your blood or the fire in your eyes, but the quiet, terrifying willingness to let your guard down and admit that the weight is too much to carry by yourself. The path to ending this isolation begins with the realization that your strength has served its purpose in keeping you alive, but it is now the very thing preventing you from truly living. And only by understanding the cost of your capability can you ever hope to find your way back to the heart of the human experience. The chasm between the external projection of an unwavering pillar and the internal landscape of a human being is a silent, expanding territory where the strongest souls often find themselves stranded. To the outside world, you are a masterclass in composure, a person whose silence is interpreted as the serene stillness of a deep lake rather than the breathless quiet of someone trying to keep from drowning in plain sight. People look at your ability to navigate crisis and assume it is a natural trait, like the color of your eyes, rather than a deliberate and exhausting labor of the will that requires constant internal maintenance. This fundamental misinterpretation creates a dangerous emotional invisibility, where your stability is taken for granted and your quietness is mistaken for satisfaction. Because you do not perform your pain in a way that is easily digestible for others, they conclude that the pain simply does not exist, leaving you to carry the crushing weight of reality while those around you applaud your strength. It is a lonely theater where the audience sees only the lead actor's triumph and never the frantic, bleeding stagehand behind the curtain. You move through your days as a living contradiction, a person whom everyone feels they know because of your reliability, yet whom no one truly perceives because they are too busy leaning on the statue you have become. This gap between your inner reality and the public's perception is not just a misunderstanding. It is a wall of glass that allows people to see you without ever actually reaching you, turning your very existence into a high-definition broadcast of a life that feels increasingly alien to the person actually living it. The isolation of the capable is built upon the faulty assumption that independence is the same thing as a lack of need, a fallacy that rewards self-sufficiency with a total withdrawal of communal support. When you prove that you can handle the difficult tasks, the messy emotions, and the logistical nightmares without asking for help, the world begins to treat your solitude as a choice rather than a circumstance. Others look at your autonomy and see a person who has evolved beyond the messy requirements of human connection, assuming that your silence in the face of struggle is a sign of ultimate peace rather than a desperate strategy for survival. This creates a psychological feedback loop where the more you endure, the less people offer to share the load, further cementing the idea that you are fundamentally different from the rest of the vulnerable herd. You become the person who is never asked how they are doing because the answer is always assumed to be fine, a word that has become a fortress protecting the world from the inconvenience of your fatigue. There is a deep, resonant ache in being surrounded by people who admire your strength but would be terrified to see your fragility, forcing you to remain locked in the identity of the hero because you suspect the alternative would lead to a total abandonment. You are trapped in a prison of your own competence, watching as the people you protect grow closer to one another through their shared weaknesses while you remain elevated and alone on a pedestal that was built without any stairs for you to climb down and join the warmth of the common ground. Every time someone tells you they wish they were as strong as you, a small part of your spirit retreats further into the shadows, realizing that what they admire is actually the very thing that is killing you. They are praising the armor, unaware that the metal has grown so heavy it is crushing the person inside, and their envy only serves to reinforce the belief that your struggle must remain a secret. This is the cruelty of emotional invisibility. Your pain is overlooked not because it is small, but because you have become too proficient at translating it into productivity and grace. The world has a narrow definition of suffering, usually requiring tears or visible collapse to trigger a response of empathy. But for the strong, suffering is a quiet, disciplined endurance that leaves no outward trace. You find yourself in a state of perpetual performance, maintaining the facade of the one who handles it, while your inner self is screaming for a reprieve that never comes because no one believes you actually need it. The tension between your private exhaustion and your public resilience creates a profound sense of dysregulation, a feeling that you are a ghost inhabiting a body that is no longer your own, but belongs to the expectations of everyone else. You are perceived as a constant, a fixed point of reliability in a chaotic world, but no one stops to consider that a constant also feels the passage of time and the erosion of its own spirit. This disconnect is where the deepest loneliness resides. In the space where your most heroic efforts to stay upright are the very things that prevent anyone from seeing that you are actually falling apart. There is a specific, agonizing type of sorrow that comes from being the person who is always there for others, but who has no one to turn to when the shadows grow long and the internal batteries run dry. This is not because you lack friends or family, but because the dynamic of your relationships has been permanently tilted by the weight of your perceived invulnerability. People bring their problems to you like offerings to an altar, seeking the clarity and strength they lack in themselves, and you provide it because that is what you have been conditioned to do. However, this exchange is rarely reciprocal. When the strong person finally attempts to speak of their own burden, they are often met with confusion, discomfort, or a swift redirection back to the other person's needs. The people in your life have fallen in love with the version of you that is a solution, and they have no category for the version of you that is a problem, leaving you to navigate your darkest nights in a vacuum of your own making. Your pain becomes a source of guilt because you feel that by expressing it, you are failing the people who rely on your stability, so you tuck it away in the deepest corners of your heart until it becomes a permanent part of your architecture. This invisibility is not accidental. It is a structural necessity of the role you have been cast in, a role that requires you to be a mirror reflecting everyone else's humanity while your own remains obscured in the dark. You are the invisible foundation of a building that everyone admires, but no one ever thinks to check for cracks. Even as the pressure from the structure above begins to compromise the very core of your foundation. As we conclude this exploration of the gap between perception and reality, it is essential to acknowledge that the silence of the strong is not a sign of peace, but a sign of a profound and growing disconnect from the self. You have lived so long as the person others see that you may have forgotten the features of the person you actually are, the one who is tired, the one who is scared, and the one who is desperately lonely despite the crowd of admirers. The strength you have cultivated is a masterpiece of adaptation, but it is also a mask that has fused to your skin, making it nearly impossible to tell where the performance ends and the truth begins. This chapter is a mirror held up to that mask, asking you to recognize the exhaustion in your own eyes and to admit that being misunderstood is a price you are no longer willing to pay for the sake of other people's comfort. The bridge between who you are and how you are seen can only be built if you are willing to let the facade crack, allowing the light of your actual, messy human experience to bleed through the armor you have worn for so long. It is a terrifying prospect to realize that the version of you that everyone loves is a curated illusion, but it is the only way to escape the isolation of being a misunderstood monument. We must move toward a definition of strength that includes the courage to be seen in our entirety, including the parts that are not useful, not productive, and not fine, for only then can the gap be closed and the loneliness be transformed into a genuine, shared connection. The strongest thing you can do is not to continue standing alone in the dark, but to step into the light and demand to be seen as a person who needs, who hurts, and who deserves to be held without having to explain why. The weight of the world does not descend all at once in a singular catastrophic moment of failure, but rather settles like fine dust upon the shoulders of the capable until the sheer accumulation of expectations becomes a mountain impossible to move. For those who have been labeled as the strong ones, life is an endless series of small surrenders to the needs of others, a slow and steady process where your own emotional boundaries are eroded by the constant demand for your stability and your grace. You have become the anchor for every ship in the harbor, the one fixed point in a sea of chaos that everyone looks to when the winds begin to howl and the waves threaten to overwhelm the shore. Yet no one ever stops to consider the immense pressure exerted on the anchor itself as it sits in the cold and crushing depths, holding the entire fleet steady while feeling the metal fatigue deep within its own core. This is the silent burden of the resilient. You are expected to be the source of strength for everyone else while being denied the right to have a source of your own, creating a vacuum where your own needs are perpetually sacrificed on the altar of collective stability. The tragedy of this role is that it is often self-perpetuating, as your ability to handle the initial pressure only serves as an invitation for the world to pile more on, assuming that because you have not broken yet, you are effectively unbreakable. You move through your days with a heavy heart that no one sees, performing the duties of the protector while the person inside the armor is quietly screaming for a moment of rest that never seems to arrive. It is a state of perpetual emotional output with no corresponding input, a recipe for a type of spiritual exhaustion that goes far beyond simple physical tiredness and enters the realm of a slow and quiet soul withering. As time marches forward, the expectations placed upon the strong individual do not remain static, but instead grow into a complex web of silent obligations that dictate every movement and every thought. What began as a willing choice to help a friend or support a family member has evolved into a permanent structural requirement of your existence, where your reliability is no longer a virtue, but a baseline expectation that you are not allowed to drop. The psychological exhaustion of always being the responsible one is a unique form of torture because it robs you of the freedom to be spontaneous or messy or even humanly fallible. You are the one who remembers the deadlines, the one who mediates the conflicts, and the one who absorbs the anxieties of everyone else, acting as a human shock absorber for the world's friction until your own internal mechanisms are worn down to nothing. This invisible pressure creates a suffocating environment where the mere thought of asking for help feels like an admission of total defeat or a betrayal of the people who depend on you. You have been cast in the role of the provider for so long that you have forgotten how to be the recipient, and the longer you stay in this role, the more impossible it becomes to step out of it without causing a systemic collapse. You are trapped in a cycle of high-level performance where the reward for your hard work is simply more work, and the prize for your emotional endurance is the privilege of carrying even heavier burdens in the future. The realization that your strength has become a form of servitude is a bitter pill to swallow, especially when you look around and see that the very people you are saving are the ones who are too comfortable to notice that you are the one who is actually in need of saving. There is a profound and hollow ache that comes from being the person everyone leans on while having no one to lean on yourself. A type of emotional isolation that feels like standing in a crowded room while being completely invisible to the eye. This is the reality of the emotional anchor. You provide the foundation for everyone else's growth and security, but you are left to float in a void of your own making, separated from the warmth of mutual support by the very strength that everyone admires. The world looks at you and sees a finished product, a person who has it all figured out, and so they stop checking in, stop offering their hands, and stop considering that you might be hurting just as much as they are. This emotional fatigue is not something that can be cured by a night of sleep or a weekend away. It is a deep-seated weariness of the spirit that arises from the constant suppression of your own vulnerability in favor of maintaining the peace for others. You have become so proficient at managing the crises of others that your own internal landscape has become a neglected wilderness, full of unvoiced fears and unprocessed grief that you simply do not have the time or the permission to address. The quiet suffering of the strong is a lonely path, marked by the echoes of your own competence and the silence of those who are too busy being helped to offer any help in return. You are a sanctuary with no doors, a place where others find refuge, but where you are forever locked outside, watching as they enjoy the safety that you have provided at the cost of your own peace of mind. It is a devastating paradox that the more capable you are of connecting with the pain of others, the more disconnected you become from the people who should be there to share in yours. The transition from being strong to being obligated is a subtle and dangerous shift that turns your natural gifts into a set of heavy chains that bind you to the needs of the collective. When your resilience becomes an obligation, you no longer have the right to be tired or the space to be weak. You are simply a tool to be used until you are spent, and then replaced by the next willing martyr. This shift happens in the small moments when your no is ignored or your boundaries are treated as personal attacks, forcing you to retreat further into the role of the selfless provider to avoid the guilt of letting people down. The invisible pressure of these expectations creates a psychological prison where the walls are made of other people's requirements and the ceiling is the limit of your own endurance. You find yourself performing a version of yourself that is always okay, always ready, and always strong, even when every cell in your body is begging for a reprieve from the relentless demands of your life. This emotional burnout is a silent fire that consumes you from the inside out, leaving the exterior intact while the core is reduced to ash and embers. You continue to move and speak and help, but the spark of joy has been extinguished by the sheer weight of the burden you carry alone, leaving you as a hollowed-out shell of the person you once were. The tragedy is that as long as you keep standing, no one will ever know how much you are struggling. And so the cycle of expectation and endurance continues until the day you finally collapse under a weight that was never meant for a single human being to bear in the first place. In the final analysis, the hidden truth about the silent burden of the strong is that it is a direct consequence of a world that values utility over humanity and performance over presence. We have created a culture that celebrates the individual who can stand alone, failing to realize that a person who is always standing alone is a person who is fundamentally disconnected from the very essence of what it means to be alive. This chapter is a testament to the quiet suffering of those who have been forgotten in the shadows of their own excellence, a call to recognize that the strength you carry is not a badge of honor, but a cry for help that has gone unanswered for too long. To move forward, you must first acknowledge the reality of your fatigue and give yourself the permission that no one else will give you to drop the weight and breathe. You are not a machine built for the convenience of others, and your worth is not measured by the number of people you can carry on your back at any given time. The path to healing begins with the terrifying act of becoming vulnerable, of showing the cracks in your foundation and the exhaustion in your soul, even if it means that some people will be disappointed by your humanity. It is only by shedding the invisible pressure of these expectations that you can begin to find your way back to a life that is motivated by love rather than obligation, and by connection rather than isolation. The strongest thing you can ever do is to admit that you are tired of being strong and to finally allow yourself to be carried by the very people you have spent your whole life protecting from the storm. True power is found not in the ability to endure the silence of a lonely burden, but in the courage to speak your truth and to demand a seat at the table of human vulnerability. The fundamental imbalance of the strong person's life begins as a subtle tilt in the room, an almost imperceptible leaning of others toward your stability that eventually hardens into a permanent and structural inequality. You have spent years cultivating a presence that suggests an infinite well of empathy and resources, and in response, the world has taken you at your word, drinking from that well until the water level drops below the reach of your own bucket. In every relationship, whether romantic, platonic, or professional, you find yourself occupying the role of the primary donor, the one who initiates the check-in, the one who listens through the midnight crisis, and the one who provides the steady hand when everyone else's is shaking. This dynamic is rarely a conscious choice made by those around you. It is a passive drift toward the path of least resistance, where people naturally gravitate toward the person who makes their lives easier while offering very little in return. You are the emotional investor who never sees a dividend, a person who pours high-octane energy into the lives of others only to be met with a low-voltage response when your own lights begin to flicker. This constant output without a corresponding intake creates a spiritual deficit that you have learned to hide behind a smile of practiced competence, but the math of your life no longer adds up. You are giving away pieces of yourself to build monuments for others, failing to notice that your own foundation is being stripped of the very materials you need to remain standing in the wind. It is an exhausting reality that turns every connection into a transaction where you are the only one paying the bill, leaving you wealthy in gratitude but bankrupt in the actual nourishment that a soul needs to survive. As this cycle of one-sided giving continues, you begin to normalize the role of the perpetual provider, convincing yourself that your value is intrinsically tied to your ability to solve problems and soothe pain. You have been trained to believe that your needs are secondary to the collective peace, and so you become a master of the silent sacrifice, tucking your own frustrations into the small, dark corners of your mind to ensure that the people you love never have to feel the weight of your fatigue. This normalization is a dangerous form of self-erasure, as it conditions those around you to treat your kindness as a natural resource rather than a deliberate gift, leading to a world where your most heroic acts of generosity are met with the same nonchalance as the rising of the sun. When your support becomes a baseline expectation, it loses its status as an act of love and becomes a service requirement, and the moment you fail to provide it, you are met with confusion or even resentment rather than understanding. You are trapped in a cage of your own excellence, where the bars are made of the very kindness you once offered freely, and the only way to maintain the status quo is to keep giving until there is nothing left but the echo of your own exhaustion. This is the slow death of the self-giver, a process where your identity is gradually consumed by the roles you play for others until you can no longer remember what it feels like to be the one who is taken care of. You have built a life where everyone feels safe except for you. And the irony is that the more you give, the more invisible your own hunger becomes to the people who are currently feasting on your energy and your time. Beneath the surface of your polished resilience, a cold and quiet resentment begins to take root, a bitter realization that the people who claim to love you are often the most blind to the sheer effort it takes for you to remain their anchor. This resentment is not born of a lack of love, but of a deep and legitimate grief for the reciprocity you have been denied, a longing for a version of connection where you don't always have to be the one holding the map and the compass. You watch as others fall apart and are held, while you fall apart and are merely told how strong you are, a phrase that has become a weapon used to silence your own cries for help before they can even leave your throat. There is a specific kind of pain in realizing that if you were to stop giving tomorrow, the majority of your social circle would vanish along with the benefits you provide, leaving you to face the silence of a life built on utility rather than genuine intimacy. This emotional depletion is a heavy, gray fog that settles over your interactions, making every conversation feel like a chore and every request for your time feel like a theft of your remaining life force. You start to count the cost of every smile and every encouraging word, aware that you are spending your last coins of patience on people who would never dream of doing the same for you. The gap between the support you offer and the support you receive is a chasm that you can no longer bridge with effort alone. And the more you try to ignore the imbalance, the more it begins to rot the very core of your relationships, turning love into a burden and connection into a source of profound and lasting irritation. The slow realization that your kindness has become a commodity rather than a connection is perhaps the most painful stage of this journey, as it forces you to confront the reality that you have trained people how to treat you by never demanding anything for yourself. You have been so effective at being the strong one that you have effectively disqualified yourself from the mercy and care that lesser mortals receive, creating a standard of perfection that no human being can sustain without breaking. This realization often arrives in a moment of quiet crisis, when you reach out for a hand and find only empty air, or when you speak of your own pain and watch the eyes of your listener glaze over with the discomfort of seeing their hero stumble. It is a cinematic psychological shift, a turning of the lens that reveals the true nature of your isolation. You are not alone because you are unlovable, but because you have made yourself too useful to be treated as a person with needs. The people in your life have grown accustomed to the version of you that is a source of infinite light, and they are terrified of the version of you that is a black hole of need. So they choose to ignore the darkness altogether, leaving you to navigate your own shadows in total solitude. You are faced with the devastating truth that your strength has been a shield not just for others, but against the very intimacy you crave, as true connection requires the one thing you have forbidden yourself to show: your own inherent and beautiful weakness. This is the emotional reality check that changes everything. The moment when you realize that the price of your current life is your own soul, and that the only way to save yourself is to stop being the one who saves everyone else. To move forward from this state of total depletion, you must begin the radical and terrifying work of reclaiming your right to be a recipient, even if it means watching the structure of your current life crumble under the weight of your own boundaries. This chapter is an invitation to stop being the infinite well and to start being a human being with limits, needs, and a finite amount of energy to give to a world that will take until you are empty. You must learn to sit in the discomfort of other people's disappointment when you say no, and to recognize that the resentment you feel is a vital signal that your spirit is being compromised by a lack of balance. True strength is not found in the ability to give until it hurts. It is found in the courage to demand that your own cup be filled by those who claim to walk beside you, and to walk away from anyone who views your exhaustion as an inconvenience. This is the turning point in the narrative of the strong person, the moment when you decide that you are no longer willing to be the invisible foundation of everyone else's happiness while you are drowning in your own silence. The road ahead is lonely in a different way, as it requires you to prune the parasitic connections that have defined your existence. But it is the only path that leads to a genuine and reciprocal love that sees you for who you are rather than what you can do. It is time to drop the burden of being the one who always understands and to start being the one who is understood, for only in that exchange can the isolation of the strong finally be healed and the cycle of giving and depletion be broken forever. You are worth more than your utility, and your heart deserves to be held with the same fierce and unwavering strength that you have given to everyone else for so long. The architecture of trust for the resilient is not a bridge built in the sunlight of optimism, but a fortress constructed in the wake of countless small betrayals that have taught the soul the heavy price of dependency. You did not begin your journey with a closed heart. Once, your hands were open and your spirit was eager to lean into the warmth of others. But time and repeated disappointment have served as a harsh education in the fragility of human commitment. Every time you reached out in a moment of genuine need only to find that the hands you had held through their own storms were suddenly occupied elsewhere. A stone was laid in the wall of your self-protection. This is the quiet erosion of faith that happens when the strong realize that their reliability is rarely mirrored by those they protect, leading to a profound psychological shift where the very idea of reliance becomes synonymous with the risk of abandonment. You have learned through the cold reality of experience that while many are willing to stand in the shade of your strength, few are prepared to weather the heat of your vulnerability, and this realization has turned trust into a rare and guarded currency. You move through the world with a cautious grace, observing the promises of others with a skeptical eye, not because you are bitter, but because you are tired of the exhaustion that comes from being let down by the people you allowed yourself to need. The fortress is now complete, and while it keeps you safe from the sting of broken promises, it also keeps you locked in a vacuum where the only person you can truly count on is the one you see in the mirror every morning, a solitary commander of a kingdom of one. The transition from collective trust to radical self-reliance is a slow and deliberate withdrawal from the social contract of mutual support, driven by a primal need to ensure that you are never again caught off guard by the absence of a safety net. You have become a scholar of human inconsistency, memorizing the patterns of those who offer help when life is easy, but vanish the moment the atmosphere thickens with the scent of a real crisis. This past evidence has shaped an emotional caution that functions like a sophisticated radar system, scanning every interaction for the subtle signs of future disappointment before you even consider lowering your guard. The psychological depth of this self-protection is immense, as it requires you to maintain a state of constant hypervigilance, ensuring that no one ever gains enough leverage over your heart to cause a structural collapse if they were to leave. You have convinced yourself that the only way to be truly invincible is to be truly independent, effectively removing the possibility of betrayal by removing the necessity of others from your internal equation. This is the lonely logic of the survivor. It is a way of living where every connection is vetted for its potential to fail, and every offer of assistance is viewed as a Trojan horse that might contain the seeds of your own undoing. You carry your own weight not because you want to, but because the memory of the times you dropped it while waiting for a hand that never came is too painful to ever repeat, turning your independence into a sacred and solitary vow that separates you from the very intimacy you were once brave enough to seek. Fear of vulnerability is the silent guardian that stands at the gates of your inner world, whispering that any moment of weakness is an invitation for the world to strike at your most tender and unprotected parts. For the strong, the act of showing a wound is not seen as an opportunity for healing, but as a strategic error that provides others with a map of your ultimate destruction. You have witnessed how vulnerability can be weaponized, or, perhaps more painfully, how it can be met with the deafening silence of those who are simply unprepared to handle the reality of your humanity. This fear is not a sign of cowardice, but a rational response to a history where your openness was treated as an inconvenience or a burden to be managed rather than a gift to be cherished. As a result, you have mastered the art of the superficial connection, offering enough of yourself to be likable and useful, while keeping the core of your being submerged in an ocean of secrets that no one is allowed to navigate. Trust has become a rare and difficult thing to give, because you understand that to trust someone is to give them the power to destroy you. And you have spent too much time rebuilding yourself from the ashes of past betrayals to ever hand over the matches again. You navigate your relationships with the precision of a diplomat in a hostile land, always aware of the exit routes, and always keeping a part of your soul in reserve, a psychological safeguard that ensures that even if everyone else walks away, you will still be standing, even if you are standing in a desert of your own creation. Emotional self-protection eventually evolves into a sophisticated form of isolation where the absence of conflict is mistaken for the presence of peace, and the lack of disappointment is viewed as a successful life strategy. You have created a world where you are the sole architect of your happiness and the only guarantor of your security, a closed system that functions with high efficiency but lacks the oxygen of true human interdependency. The cost of this safety is a slow-growing emotional numbness, as the same walls that keep out the pain also prevent the entry of the deep, transformative love that can only exist when two people are willing to be seen in their most broken states. You watch from the ramparts of your fortress as others engage in the messy, beautiful, and often painful dance of mutual reliance, feeling a strange mix of pity and envy for their willingness to be so dangerously exposed to one another. Your strength has become a barrier to the very connection that would make your life worth living, as trust requires a leap of faith that your calculated mind is no longer willing to take without a guarantee of success. You are trapped in a paradox where the more you protect yourself from the possibility of betrayal, the more you ensure the reality of your own solitude, turning your rare currency of trust into a treasure that is buried so deep that even you can no longer find the key to the vault. The realization that you have become your own jailer is a heavy and silent truth that haunts the quiet spaces of your self-reliance, reminding you that a life without risk is also a life without the reward of being truly known and held by someone who has earned the right to see your soul. In the final reckoning of this chapter, we must confront the reality that the struggle to rely on others is not a defect of character, but a profound testament to the weight of the life you have lived and the battles you have fought in silence. This cautious approach to intimacy is the shadow cast by your own resilience, a necessary adaptation for a person who has had to be their own hero for far too long to believe in the rescue of others. However, to move toward a future that is not defined by the scars of the past, you must eventually find the courage to allow for the possibility of a different outcome, even if it feels like a betrayal of the survival instincts that have kept you alive. This chapter is an invitation to examine the walls you have built and to ask yourself if they are still serving as a shield or if they have become the bars of a cage that is keeping the world out and your heart in. The rare currency of trust can only grow in value if it is put into circulation, and while the risk of loss is real and terrifying, the cost of hoarding it is the total bankruptcy of the spirit. True strength is found not in the absolute certainty of self-reliance, but in the terrifying willingness to let someone else carry the light for a while, even if you suspect they might let it flicker or fade in the dark. It is the act of stepping outside the fortress, with all your history and all your caution, and deciding that the potential for a genuine, shared connection is worth the risk of another disappointment. The road to ending your isolation begins with the slow and difficult work of reopening the gates and learning, one small and trembling step at a time, that to be strong is to survive, but to trust is to finally and truly live. The architecture of the soul is rarely altered by a single seismic event, but is instead reshaped by the slow and silent accumulation of defensive layers that eventually harden into a fortress the occupant no longer remembers how to leave. For the resilient individual, the construction of emotional walls begins as a series of necessary repairs to a spirit that has been weathered by the storms of overextension and the cold winds of unreciprocated care. You did not set out one morning with the intention of sealing yourself away from the world. Rather, you simply added a small partition here to dull the sting of a friend's indifference, and a reinforced gate there to block the entry of another person's exhausting crisis. Each boundary was an act of self-preservation, a logical response to a world that seemed determined to consume your energy without offering any replenishment in return, and in the beginning, these barriers felt like a triumph of the will. They provided a newfound clarity and a sense of safety that allowed you to function at a high level without being constantly derailed by the emotional turbulence of those around you. However, the tragedy of these invisible walls is their quiet, creeping nature. They grow in the dark spaces of your subconscious, fed by every moment you chose to stay silent rather than speak your truth, and every time you prioritized your competence over your connection. You become a master of the polite distance, a person who is present in every room but accessible in none, slowly losing the ability to distinguish between a healthy boundary and a total blockade of the heart. By the time you realize that the walls are high enough to block out the sun, they have already become a permanent part of your psychological landscape, leaving you as the solitary ruler of a kingdom that is as secure as it is utterly and profoundly empty. The irony of emotional protection is that the very structures designed to keep the pain at bay eventually become the primary cause of a much deeper and more pervasive suffering known as the isolation of the successful. When you first began to build these internal defenses, they served as a vital filter that allowed you to maintain your focus and your strength in the face of mounting external pressure, acting as a buffer between your sensitive core and the relentless demands of a world that viewed you as a utility. You felt empowered by your newfound ability to remain unmoved by the drama of others, mistaking this detachment for a form of enlightenment or superior emotional intelligence. But as the walls thickened, they began to filter out not just the noise and the pain, but also the warmth, the light, and the spontaneous joy that can only be found in the messy, unfiltered exchange of human vulnerability. Protection is a seductive mistress because it promises a life without the sharp edges of disappointment. Yet it fails to mention that a life without edges is a life without shape, substance, or true meaning. You find yourself standing in a perfectly climate-controlled environment of your own making, where nothing can hurt you, but nothing can reach you either, turning your existence into a high-resolution broadcast of a reality you are no longer allowed to touch. The safety you fought so hard to achieve has morphed into a sterile prison where the air is thin and the silence is deafening, revealing the cruel paradox that the ultimate defense against being hurt is to stop being fully alive. You have succeeded in making yourself unbreakable, but in doing so, you have also made yourself unreachable, and the strength that once saved you is now the very thing that prevents you from experiencing the only thing that truly matters. As the walls settle into their final form, a subtle and pervasive emotional numbness begins to take root, a gradual cooling of the spirit that turns the vibrant colors of your inner life into a series of predictable and muted shades of gray. This is not the dramatic crash of a clinical depression, but a sophisticated and quiet detachment, a way of moving through the world where you can still perform the motions of empathy and connection without actually feeling the weight of them in your chest. You have become so proficient at managing your emotional responses to prevent further injury that you have effectively dampened the entire frequency of your soul, leaving you in a state of perpetual observation rather than participation. When people share their stories of heartbreak or triumph with you, you find yourself analyzing the data of their experience and providing the correct social responses while remaining fundamentally unimpacted by the human truth of their words. This detachment is the final layer of the fortress, a psychological insulation that ensures that even if someone manages to climb the walls, they will find nothing but a hollowed-out shell of the person you used to be. You have optimized your psyche for survival, eliminating the variables of passion and pain to ensure a steady state of operational efficiency. But in this optimization, the essence of your humanity has been sacrificed. You move through your relationships like a ghost in a machine, providing support and stability to everyone around you while feeling a growing sense of unreality about your own existence. The numbness is a protective fog that hides the fact that you have become a stranger to yourself, a person who is so well protected that even your own desires and fears can no longer find their way to the surface of your conscious mind. The transition from being a person with boundaries to being a person who is truly isolated happens in the quiet moments of realization when you look across the dinner table or the office desk and realize that no one in your life actually knows the person behind the performance. This is the stage where the walls you built without awareness become undeniable, as you recognize the vast distance between your public persona of the unshakable leader and your private reality of the exhausted and lonely human being. You have trained the people in your life to respect your privacy and admire your independence so effectively that they no longer even attempt to peek behind the curtain, leaving you trapped in a role that has become a permanent and suffocating mask. The psychological breakdown of these defenses usually begins with a crushing sense of fatigue, not from the work you do, but from the immense effort required to keep the walls standing in the face of your own mounting need for connection. You start to notice the small ways you avoid intimacy, the way you deflect personal questions with humor or professional updates, and the way you subtly pull back, when someone tries to offer you the very support you have spent your life providing for others. It is a slow and painful awakening to the fact that you have been the architect of your own loneliness, building a monument to your strength that has also served as a tomb for your capacity to love and be loved in return. The realization that you are safer than you have ever been, yet more alone than you ever thought possible, creates a profound internal tension that can no longer be ignored, forcing you to confront the terrifying truth that your protection has become your greatest enemy, and your walls have become your final and absolute boundary. To begin the process of dismantling the walls you didn't notice building, you must first find the courage to admit that the safety they provide is no longer worth the cost of the isolation they demand. This chapter is a mirror held up to the fortress of your soul, asking you to recognize the beauty of the person you have hidden away and the tragic necessity of letting them breathe again in the open air of a messy and unpredictable world. Tearing down these defenses is not a single act of destruction, but a slow and deliberate process of unlearning the habits of a lifetime of self-protection, a journey that requires you to step out from behind the stone and the steel and allow yourself to be seen in all your fragile and magnificent humanity. It involves the terrifying task of reopening the gates of your heart to the possibility of being misunderstood, being hurt, and being let down, with the understanding that these risks are the only price of admission for a life of genuine connection and shared meaning. You must learn to value your vulnerability as much as you have valued your strength, recognizing that the cracks in your armor are not signs of weakness, but the only places where the light of another person's love can truly enter. The path away from isolation begins with the first trembling word of truth spoken to someone you have kept at a distance, a small breach in the wall that allows the first draft of fresh air to reach the center of your spirit. It is the realization that true power is found not in the ability to remain untouched by the world, but in the willingness to be transformed by it, and that the only way to end the silence of the strong is to finally, bravely, and loudly demand to be known. Your walls have served their purpose in keeping you alive through the dark, but it is time to let them fall so that you can finally, for the first time in a long time, find your way back home to yourself and to the people who are waiting for you in the light. The boundary between healthy independence and profound isolation is not a marked border, but a shifting, invisible line that the strong often cross without realizing they have left the land of the living and entered a wasteland of their own making. At first, your self-reliance was a source of immense and legitimate pride, a testament to your ability to navigate the complexities of existence without leaning on the fragile crutches of external validation or assistance. You found a deep, quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that you were the architect of your own success and the sole protector of your peace, viewing every task completed alone as a victory for your autonomy and your will. This independence was your signature, the defining trait that set you apart from a world that seemed increasingly dependent and helpless, and you wore your ability to stand alone like a badge of honor forged in the fires of your own resilience. There is an intoxicating power in believing that you need nothing from anyone, a sense of total control that provides a temporary buffer against the inherent unpredictability of human connection. But as this independence hardens into a lifestyle, the pride you feel begins to take on a sharper, more restrictive edge, transforming from a source of strength into a mandatory performance of invulnerability. You have cultivated a self-image so rooted in solitary capability that the mere thought of reaching out feels like a betrayal of your very essence. a crack in the foundation of the person you have spent decades building. The line is crossed the moment your choice to do it alone becomes an inability to do it any other way, leaving you stranded in a state of high-functioning solitude where your greatest achievement has become the primary instrument of your own emotional exile from the world. As this extreme self-reliance takes root, a persistent and uncomfortable internal conflict begins to fester between the pride of your competence and the mounting ache of a loneliness that you have no vocabulary to express. On the surface, you continue to move through the world with the same polished autonomy, completing your projects and managing your crises with a precision that garners the admiration of everyone who watches you from the safety of their own dependencies. You tell yourself that the silence of your life is the price of your freedom, and for a long time, the pride of that freedom is enough to keep the shadows at bay during the busy hours of the day. However, in the stillness of the night, the weight of being your own only witness starts to feel less like a triumph and more like a heavy, airless vacuum that is slowly compressing your spirit. You are caught in a psychological stalemate where admitting to loneliness feels like a total invalidation of the strength you have used to define your worth, creating a shame that forces you to hide your human needs even deeper within the fortress of your autonomy. This conflict is a grueling war of attrition played out in the private theater of your mind, where every moment of exhaustion is met with a stern internal lecture on the necessity of endurance and the weakness of those who need others. You have become a prisoner of your own high standards, locked in a cycle where the more lonely you feel, the more you double down on your independence to prove that you don't need the very thing you were starving for. The pride that once lifted you up has become the weight that keeps you submerged, creating a life that is impressive to everyone except the person who has to live it in the absolute and unchanging cold of total self-sufficiency. For the person who has mastered the art of being the anchor, the act of asking for help has become an unnatural and deeply repulsive concept, a foreign language that the tongue can no longer find the mechanics to speak. After years of being the one who provides the answers and holds the line, the idea of revealing a gap in your own capability feels like a catastrophic structural failure, a moment of naked exposure that your survival instincts are programmed to avoid at any cost. You have spent so much time convincing the world and yourself that you are a closed system, a perpetual motion machine of productivity and grace, that the simple phrase, "I need you," feels like a surrender of your entire identity. When a crisis truly hits and the burden becomes objectively too much for one person to carry, you find yourself paralyzed not by the difficulty of the task, but by the sheer psychological impossibility of inviting someone else into the messy reality of your struggle. This resistance is not born of arrogance, but of a deep-seated fear that if you once allow the mask of self-reliance to slip, the entire illusion of your life will shatter, and you will be left with nothing but the raw, unpolished vulnerability of a person who is simply not enough. You have been rewarded for your independence for so long that you have lost the muscle memory of interdependency, making the gesture of reaching out feel like a dangerous leap into a void where you have no guarantee of being caught. This is the tragic irony of the strong. You are the most capable of helping others because you understand the depth of their need, yet you are the least capable of receiving help because you have made your own need a forbidden territory that no one, not even those who love you, is allowed to enter. The emotional consequences of this extreme self-reliance are far-reaching and destructive, manifesting as a slow erosion of your capacity for genuine intimacy and a growing sense of detachment from the common fabric of human experience. When you refuse to rely on others, you effectively disqualify yourself from the primary mechanism through which humans form deep, lasting bonds. As intimacy is built in the shared space of mutual need and the quiet exchanges of vulnerability. By insisting on doing everything alone, you are inadvertently sending a message to the world that you are a finished product that requires no further input, leading people to naturally withdraw their care and their attention from a person who seems to have no use for it. This creates a feedback loop of isolation where your perceived independence discourages connection, and the lack of connection further reinforces your belief that you must rely only on yourself. Over time, this results in a type of emotional atrophy where the parts of your soul that were designed for partnership and community begin to wither from disuse, leaving you in a state of high-alert solitude that is exhausting to maintain. You find yourself feeling like an observer in your own relationships, watching the easy exchange of support between others with a mixture of confusion and a quiet, searing resentment that you are never the recipient of such grace. The cost of your autonomy is a life lived in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, where you are safe from the disappointment of others, but entirely cut off from the nourishment of their presence, turning your strength into a sterile and airless environment that supports survival but prohibits the growth of a truly meaningful and connected existence. In the final psychological analysis of the line between independence and isolation, we must recognize that the ultimate goal of human development is not total self-sufficiency, but the courage to be healthily interdependent. This chapter is a stark reality check for the strong, a call to examine the true cost of the pride you take in your solitary endurance, and to realize that the walls you have built in the name of freedom are actually the boundaries of a very small and lonely cell. To heal the rift between your capability and your loneliness, you must begin the difficult work of dismantling the idea that needing someone is a failure of your character, and instead view it as a necessary and beautiful requirement of your humanity. This shift requires a radical redefinition of strength, moving away from the image of the lone wolf and toward the image of the person who is brave enough to let their guard down and admit that the weight is too heavy to carry in total solitude. It is a journey that starts with small, uncomfortable acts of transparency, admitting you are tired, asking for a minor favor, or simply allowing someone to see you in a moment of genuine uncertainty. You must learn to tolerate the discomfort of being helped, recognizing that by allowing others to support you, you are not losing your independence, but gaining the depth of connection that makes independence worth having in the first place. The path out of isolation is paved with the recognition that true power is found in the ability to move between the roles of the protector and the protected, and that the strongest thing you can ever do is to stop pretending that you don't need the very hands that have been reaching for you all along. Only by stepping across that invisible line back into the world of shared burdens can you find the peace that your solitary strength has promised but has never been able to deliver on its own. The fear of being truly seen is the final, most fortified gate in the internal architecture of the strong, a barrier built not out of a desire for mystery, but out of a desperate, learned necessity for survival in a world that has often punished your openness. For the resilient individual, vulnerability is not an invitation for connection. It is a tactical error, a moment of naked exposure that feels like handing a weapon to a potential adversary and hoping they choose to put it down. You have lived through 1,000 subtle instances where your transparency was met with a lack of care, or worse, where your deepest admissions were used as leverage against you in your most fragile moments. This history has calcified into a profound psychological caution, a sense that your true internal landscape is a territory too dangerous for anyone else to inhabit without a guarantee of absolute safety that never seems to arrive. You have learned to equate being seen with being scrutinized, judged, and eventually found lacking, turning the act of emotional disclosure into a source of intense and paralyzing anxiety. This is why you remain behind the glass of your own composure, watching the world through a layer of polished indifference that protects you from the sting of rejection but prevents the warmth of genuine intimacy from reaching your core. You have convinced yourself that as long as the world only sees the version of you that is unshakable and whole, you can maintain a level of control over your own destiny that would be shattered by the admission of your fear or your fatigue. The tragedy of this defense is that it creates a life where you are admired but never understood, respected but never truly touched, leaving you as a ghost in the machine of your own existence, forever hiding the very parts of yourself that are most in need of being held and affirmed by another human being. The act of hiding your struggles behind a mask of unwavering composure is a sophisticated performance that requires an immense and exhausting expenditure of energy, yet you maintain it because the alternative feels like a total and irreversible collapse of your identity. You move through your days with the precision of a tightrope walker, aware that the slightest slip into genuine emotion could trigger a cascade of questions you are not prepared to answer and a level of attention you have not authorized. This composure is your armor, a shield of silence and competence that tells the world you are fine, even when the internal pressure of your unvoiced pain is threatening to tear you apart from the inside out. You have become so proficient at this deception that you have managed to fool even those closest to you, creating a reality where your reliability has become a screen onto which everyone else projects their own needs and expectations. The psychological weight of this performance is staggering, as it forces you to live in a state of perpetual self-surveillance, constantly monitoring your expressions and your words to ensure that the cracks in your foundation are never visible to the naked eye. You are terrified that if you were to show the true depth of your exhaustion, the world would not offer you rest, but would instead back away in fear or disappointment, unable to reconcile the human reality of your struggle with the myth of your invulnerability. This fear of judgment is a silent predator that haunts every conversation and every interaction, making the prospect of being truly seen feel less like a relief and more like a catastrophic threat to the only version of yourself that the world has ever accepted or rewarded with its conditional love and its distant admiration. For the person who has spent a lifetime being the anchor, being seen emotionally feels fundamentally more threatening than being alone, because solitude is a state of control while vulnerability is a state of surrender. To be alone is to be the master of your own silence, but to be seen is to be at the mercy of another person's perception, a reality that your history of disappointment has taught you is a dangerous and unpredictable place to be. You have come to view your internal world as a sacred and fragile space that must be guarded at all costs, believing that the moment you reveal your true self, you are no longer the one in charge of your own narrative. This perception of vulnerability as a lack of power is a direct consequence of a life lived in a state of hypervigilance, where any sign of weakness was an invitation for the world to impose its will upon you or to abandon you altogether when you were no longer useful. You find the prospect of an honest emotional exchange to be terrifyingly intense, as it requires you to drop the very defenses that have kept you standing through the darkest seasons of your life. The resulting isolation is a heavy price to pay, but in the twisted logic of your survival instincts, it is a price you are willing to pay to avoid the crushing blow of a misunderstanding that cuts to the bone. You have decided that it is better to be a mystery that no one solves than a person who is seen and then discarded, turning your solitude into a sanctuary where you can breathe without the fear of being found wanting. This is the profound and slightly painful truth of the strong. You have made yourself unreachable because you have survived too much to believe that being reached is a safe or sustainable option, leaving you in a state of high-alert loneliness that is as secure as it is utterly and devastatingly devoid of the connection you secretly crave. The fear of rejection is not just about the loss of a specific person, but about the total invalidation of the strength you have used to build your entire sense of self-worth and purpose in a world that values performance. You suspect that if people knew how much effort it actually takes for you to remain their pillar of stability, they would view your strength not as a virtue, but as a facade, and your resilience as a form of manipulation or dishonesty. This fear of being misunderstood at the deepest level keeps you locked in a cycle of isolation, as you would rather be lonely for the right reasons than be known and judged for the wrong ones. You look at the ease with which others share their feelings, and you feel like an alien species, unable to bridge the gap between your public composure and your private reality of fear and doubt. The psychological depth of this self-protection is immense, as it prevents you from ever experiencing the type of love that is predicated on the knowledge of your flaws and the acceptance of your inherent and beautiful humanity. You are trapped in a role that has become a prison, performing a version of yourself that you no longer fully recognize, and the longer you stay in this role, the more the idea of being seen feels like a terrifying and impossible dream. You have normalized the silence of your struggles to the point where they have become a part of your fundamental identity, making the act of speaking them feel like a betrayal of the person you have worked so hard to become in the eyes of a world that is always watching, but rarely truly seeing the heart beneath the armor you wear with such practiced and tragic grace. In the final, most introspective reckoning of this chapter, we must acknowledge that the fear of being truly seen is the ultimate obstacle to the very connection that would heal the isolation of the strong and allow the soul to breathe again. This chapter is a mirror held up to the terror that resides at the core of your resilience, asking you to recognize that the safety you have achieved through your silence is a sterile and airless kind of peace that will eventually consume everything it was meant to protect. To break the cycle of loneliness, you must eventually find the courage to be seen not as a hero or an anchor, but as a person who is terrified, tired, and profoundly in need of a place to land without being judged for the weight of your history. This is a radical and painful shift that requires you to dismantle the belief that vulnerability is danger and to replace it with the understanding that transparency is the only path to the type of love that can truly sustain a human heart over the long haul of a difficult life. It involves the slow and deliberate work of letting one person in, showing one crack in the armor, and speaking one truth that you have kept hidden in the dark for far too long to remember why you hid it in the first place. True strength is found not in the ability to remain behind the wall of your composure, but in the willingness to let that wall fall and to stand in the open air of your own humanity, trusting that the people who truly matter will see the light in your eyes even through the tears and the exhaustion. The road to ending your isolation begins with the realization that being alone is not a solution to the fear of being seen, but a manifestation of that fear, and that the only way to find your way back to the heart of the world is to finally, bravely, and with all your trembling heart, allow yourself to be seen for exactly who you are. The dawn of awareness does not arrive as a sudden flash of blinding light, but as a slow and persistent tide that gradually pulls the veil back from the complex architecture of your own solitude. For the person who has lived as an unbreakable pillar, the first step toward breaking the cycle of loneliness is the quiet and often painful recognition that the very traits you once celebrated as your greatest strengths are the same ones that have meticulously constructed your exile. You begin to see the patterns in your behavior like lines on a map you never realized you were following. The way you preemptively withdraw to avoid the sting of expected disappointment. The way you translate every moment of genuine need into a task to be managed. And the way you have trained the people in your life to never look too closely at the cracks in your foundation. This realization is a heavy and grounding emotional awakening, as it forces you to confront the reality that your isolation is not a passive event that happened to you, but a structure you have actively maintained in the name of safety. Understanding these patterns is the first and most vital movement toward a different way of being, as it transforms your loneliness from a mysterious and inevitable fate into a visible and manageable consequence of your internal defense systems. It is the moment you stop asking why no one is there for you and start asking how you have made it impossible for them to be, a transition that is as terrifying as it is profoundly liberating. You are finally standing at the center of your own life, no longer a victim of your resilience, but a conscious observer of the habits that have kept your heart in a state of perpetual winter while you were busy building a world that looked perfectly sunny for everyone else. As the fog of habit begins to lift, you find yourself caught in a grueling internal conflict between the familiar comfort of your isolation and a deep, burgeoning desire for the kind of connection that requires you to step into the unknown. There is a strange and seductive safety in being alone. It is a controlled environment where you are never misunderstood because you never speak, and where you are never rejected because you never ask for anything, creating a predictable peace that is hard to abandon. However, that peace is increasingly being overshadowed by a gnawing hunger for the warmth of a shared burden and the relief of being truly known by another human soul. You are trapped between the person you have been forced to become for the sake of survival and the person you are desperately longing to be for the sake of your own humanity, a psychological stalemate that creates a profound and restless tension in your spirit. The pride of your self-reliance continues to whisper that you are losing your edge by wanting more, while your heart insists that a life lived in total autonomy is merely a long and well-organized wait for the end. This struggle is not a sign of weakness, but the birth pangs of a new identity, as you grapple with the realization that the fortress you built to protect yourself has become the primary obstacle to your growth. You are learning to sit with the discomfort of this duality, recognizing that the desire for connection is not a betrayal of your strength, but its ultimate fulfillment, as it takes a far greater power to be vulnerable in the presence of another than it does to remain stoically and safely alone in the dark. Emotional resistance to change is the final and most formidable guardian of the old cycle, manifesting as a visceral fear that if you drop your guard even slightly, the entire world you have built will come crashing down around you. Every time you consider reaching out or showing a sliver of your true self, your nervous system reacts as if you are stepping into a life-threatening storm, triggering a cascade of defensive thoughts designed to pull you back into the sanctuary of your own composure. You are terrified that if you start being honest about your fatigue or your fear, people will look at you with pity rather than respect, or that the people who rely on your stability will be frightened away by the sight of your fragility. This resistance is a manifestation of the belief that your worth is entirely dependent on your utility, a lie that has been reinforced by years of being rewarded for your silence and your service. You find yourself retreating into the old habits of the anchor the moment things feel too real, performing the role of the capable one even as your soul screams for the permission to just be tired for a single, unobserved hour. Overcoming this resistance requires a radical and patient kindness toward yourself, as you acknowledge that the walls you built were once necessary and that tearing them down will be a slow and frightening process of trial and error. It is the work of a lifetime condensed into a series of small, trembling choices to stay present in the discomfort rather than running back to the sterile safety of your solitary competence. A slow unlearning of the survival instincts that kept you alive but have now become the very things that are preventing you from truly living. Hope begins to take root not in the promise of a perfect and painless future, but in the grounded and realistic understanding that you are no longer a prisoner of the history that created your defenses. This hope is a quiet and sturdy thing, built on the evidence of your own awareness and the realization that while you cannot change the past that made you strong, you have the absolute power to choose how that strength is used in the present. It is the belief that a life of reciprocity is possible, even for someone who has spent decades being the only one who gives, provided you are willing to do the difficult work of retraining yourself and the people around you to see your needs as valid. You are starting to see that true resilience is not about the absence of need, but about the courage to acknowledge it, and that the path toward connection is paved with the small, daily acts of transparency that allow others to see the human being behind the hero. This is not a journey toward a destination where you will never feel alone again, but toward a state of being where you are no longer afraid of your own loneliness and no longer ashamed to ask for a hand to hold in the dark. You are beginning to trust that there are people in the world who are capable of holding your weight without breaking, and that by allowing them to try, you are giving them the opportunity to love you in the way you have always deserved. This new perspective is a slow-burning fire that warms the cold corners of your heart, providing the light you need to see the way forward without the crushing weight of the armor you have worn for so long that you forgot it was ever meant to be removed. Breaking the cycle of loneliness is ultimately an act of profound and revolutionary self-love, a decision to stop being the invisible foundation of everyone else's life and to start being the visible and valuable center of your own. This chapter marks the end of your time as a misunderstood monument and the beginning of your journey as a person who is brave enough to be seen, to be helped, and to be held by a world that has been waiting for your arrival. It is an emotional awakening that requires you to hold your history with grace while firmly letting go of the habits that no longer serve the person you are becoming. The path ahead is not easy, and there will be moments when the silence of the old fortress feels like the only safe place left, but you are now equipped with the awareness that safety is not the same as peace, and that survival is not the same as being alive. You are learning to value the messy, unpredictable, and beautiful exchange of human vulnerability more than the cold and predictable perfection of your solitary strength. And in that shift, the cycle is already beginning to break. You are stepping out of the shadows of your own excellence and into the light of a genuine, shared existence, where your strength is no longer a barrier, but a bridge that allows you to connect with the hearts of others in a way that is both meaningful and sustainable. The strongest thing you can ever do is to admit that you are ready for a different story, one where you are the hero not because you stood alone, but because you had the courage to finally allow yourself to be found and loved in the middle of your most human and honest struggle. The final evolution of the resilient spirit begins with the radical act of redefining strength, moving away from the cold imagery of the solitary mountain toward the vibrant and interconnected reality of the living forest. We have spent a lifetime believing that to be powerful is to be untouched by the world, but true strength is found in the fluid and courageous balance between holding the line for others and allowing yourself to be held in return. It is the realization that a pillar which refuses to lean is not a symbol of stability, but a victim of its own rigidity, while a heart that can bend, reach, and weave itself into the lives of others is the ultimate manifestation of human endurance. True power does not reside in the ability to carry the world on your shoulders in total silence. It lives in the wisdom to know when to speak, the grace to know when to listen, and the profound bravery required to let your guard down in a world that has taught you to keep it raised. You are beginning to understand that vulnerability is not a leakage of your authority, but the very source of it, a bridge of common humanity that allows you to lead from a place of authenticity rather than from behind a mask of hollow perfection. This shift in perspective is the key to unlocking the cage of your own excellence, transforming your competence from a tool of isolation into an instrument of genuine connection that honors both your capability and your humanity. You are no longer defined by what you can survive alone, but by the depth of the relationships you are willing to nurture through the honest and beautiful exchange of your true self, proving that the most resilient souls are not those who never break, but those who are brave enough to let the light shine through the cracks. Rebuilding a life of connection does not require you to sacrifice the independence you have worked so hard to cultivate. Instead, it demands that you integrate that independence into a healthy and vibrant state of interdependency. You are discovering that you can remain a leader, a protector, and a source of wisdom, while simultaneously being a person who has needs, fears, and a finite capacity for emotional output. This is the process of reclaiming your identity from the roles you have played for others, ensuring that your value is no longer tied to your utility, but to your inherent presence as a unique and multifaceted human being. As you begin to set boundaries that protect your own spirit as much as they protect your time, you are teaching the world a new way to love you, one that values your essence over your performance. You are learning to invite people into your process rather than just presenting them with a finished result, allowing them to see the effort, the doubt, and the dedication that goes into every act of strength you perform. This transparency is the foundation of a new kind of intimacy, one where you are respected for your resilience, but loved for your reality, creating a balanced ecosystem of support that sustains everyone involved. You are not losing your edge by becoming more accessible. You are sharpening it with the clarity that comes from being truly seen and supported by those who walk beside you. The fortress is being replaced by a home, a space where your strength is a choice rather than a mandatory sentence of isolation, and where your autonomy is celebrated as a vital component of a shared and meaningful existence that no longer requires you to stand in the shadows of your own life. The journey toward emotional healing is marked by the quiet acceptance of your history as a teacher rather than a jailer, allowing the scars of your past disappointments to become the textures of a more compassionate and grounded present. You are learning to forgive the version of yourself that felt it had to be unbreakable to survive, recognizing that those old defenses were an act of profound self-love in a time when you were your only protector. This acceptance allows you to release the heavy and exhausting grip of hypervigilance, creating the internal space necessary for new growth and the cultivation of a trust that is built on discernment rather than blind optimism. You are finding that the more you heal the rift within yourself, the more the world begins to respond to you with a different kind of energy, gravitating toward your warmth rather than just leaning on your steel. This transformation is a slow and sacred process of coming home to your own heart, where the silence that once felt like a burden is being replaced by a peaceful and resonant awareness of your own worth. You are discovering that you do not need to be perfect to be worthy of care, and that your most powerful moments of growth often occur in the very spaces where you allowed yourself to be most humanly flawed and vulnerable. The emotional fatigue that once defined your existence is lifting, replaced by a steady and sustainable vitality that comes from living in alignment with your true self. You are no longer running from your own need for connection, but walking toward it with the quiet confidence of a person who knows that their strength is not a barrier to love, but the very vessel through which love is most deeply expressed and received. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration, the powerful realization begins to take hold that strength and loneliness do not need to coexist, and that the most profound form of power is the ability to be both strong and connected in equal measure. You have spent so long believing that your capability was the cause of your isolation, but you now see that it was merely the armor you chose to wear in the absence of safety. The myth of the lone wolf is finally crumbling, replaced by the reality of the resilient heart that finds its ultimate purpose in the shared experiences of the collective. You are standing at the threshold of a new way of living, where your endurance is balanced by your capacity for rest, and your independence is enriched by your willingness to rely on the hands of others. This is the cinematic transformation of your soul, a movement from the monochrome world of solitary survival into the high-definition color of a life lived in full, honest communion with the world around you. You are realizing that the highest expression of your strength is not found in how much you can handle alone, but in how much love you can allow yourself to receive while standing in the fullness of your own power. The silence of the strong has been broken, not by a cry of defeat, but by the resonant voice of a person who has finally claimed their right to be both a hero and a human being. You are the architect of a new narrative, one where your resilience is the foundation of your community and your vulnerability is the light that guides others home. The cycle is complete, and you are stepping into a future where you are no longer defined by the height of your walls, but by the breadth of your heart and the depth of the connections that now sustain you in every season of your life. The story of the strongest people ending up alone is a tragedy that ends today, as you embrace the transformative truth that your journey was never meant to be a solo flight into the dark. You are part of a grand and beautiful tapestry of human experience, where every thread of your strength is woven together with the threads of those who love you, creating a fabric that is far more resilient than any single strand could ever hope to be. This final chapter is a celebration of your arrival at the intersection of power and peace, a place where you no longer have to choose between being respected and being held. You have survived the isolation, you have dismantled the defenses, and you have reclaimed the rare currency of your trust, emerging not as a diminished version of yourself, but as a more complete and vibrant individual than ever before. The world is waiting for the version of you that is brave enough to be seen. And as you step forward into the light, you carry with you the profound understanding that true strength is the ability to stay open even when it hurts, to keep reaching even when you are tired, and to keep loving even when you know the cost. You are the embodiment of a new kind of power, one that is rooted in balance, fueled by connection, and sustained by the unshakable knowledge that you are never truly alone when you are finally, fully, and authentically yourself. This is your victory, not a victory over others, but a victory over the fear that kept you small and the pride that kept you distant. You are strong, you are seen, and you are loved. And in this realization, the burden of the anchor is finally laid down, replaced by the effortless and magnificent grace of a soul that has finally found its way back to the heart of everything.